With the dust settling on transactions around the NHL, a lot of teams have questions. What are the Edmonton Oilers' biggest questions going into the heart of the summer? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network where we've got your team covered every day. I am 3 seasons into a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm so glad you guys are here, even in the doldrums of summer. As free agency and the trade market die down, there is still hockey to discuss. But before we get there, today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So on today's show, we're going to just address some big questions for the Oilers going into the heart of the summer, where things will probably die down for the rest of July, and action will get going again the closer we get to September. Middle of September generally is when guys will start to get back to Edmonton. You'll have informal workouts. You'll have player organized stuff, not team organized stuff. And then by mid-September, we'll be going on a preseason and a regular season soon enough. But we got a while to go before we get there. And these types of open-ended questions, they're a good thought exercise, and it presents an opportunity for me to give you a bit of an idea of how I think. And I find this to be the most interesting component of sports discourse. It's not just I want to know your opinion. I want to know how you got to your opinion. What about your values or your opinions got you there? What about your life experiences got you to this position? So the first question, and the biggest question facing the Edmonton Oilers, how long and how much will Connor McDavid's next contract be worth? That's our initial question. So the player side of things, if I were Connor McDavid and I were his agent, I would be telling him 3 or 4 year deal max, because we are going to be operating in an environment where the salary cap is going to explode. Then on top of that, we have new TV deals on the way. So not just are your conventional hockey revenues, and the biggest chunk of NHL revenues is gate, it's attendance, it's people physically buying tickets and going to games. That still makes up almost 60% of the NHL's overall revenues. But the real rocket fuel to league growth and salary cap growth across the board is television rights. You look at where TV rights have been, how much they've been paid for, how much networks have paid for them, and the commiserate boon in player salaries and available money overall. And you very quickly realize that this is your shortcut, if you will. It's not enough to do big numbers at the gate. And the NHL had a good attendance year last year. You get a new TV deal, and one of the luxuries hockey does have, one of the few market luxuries they do have, you get a TV deal in Canada and in the United States to operate from. So you get 2 coffers to draw from that are major markets that pay big money. So if I'm Connor McDavid, I'm taking a 3 or 4 year deal. It's going to be worth $15 million per year, $16 million per year. And then 3 or 4 years from now, when the salary cap's $120, $130 million, then I'm going to do it again. And I'll only be 31 or 32 years old. And that'll put me in a position to get probably north of $20 million per year, 3 to 4 years from now on an average annual basis. Now, if you're the Oilers, you would like the complete opposite of that. If there were a world where you could convince Connor to take 8 years at $17 million per year right now, that becomes one of the great value contracts in the history of the sport right now. You think about what Sidney Crosby took, that $8.7 million deal way back when he did that first really, really long-term deal coming out of that one lockout. And that contract aged incredibly well. And Sid gave the Penguins a ton of excess value. And it's one of the keys to how they built such a good contender around him during the mid-2010s. Now, there is something to be said for Jim Rutherford wasting that cap flexibility on stupid things after winning the back-to-back cups, but they did win the 2 cups, which is ultimately the goal here. So I think that's an interesting subplot to see how the Oilers want to go, how Connor wants to go, and how those two butt heads, because they are in direct conflict with each other. We're talking about labor and we're talking about management. These are two parties who materially have different objectives. If I had to guess, I'm thinking we're getting something in the ballpark of 4 to 5 years, probably like $16 million per year. And that'll put Connor at 33, 34 years old. That'll put him in a position to get one more big deal before we talk about maybe twilight of his career, what that last contract looks like. Does he want to go the Sid route and save money? Does he want to go the Ovi route and get close to as much of his maximum value as he can? The next question I have, and one I think is really worth debating, what's realistic as far as Matthew Savoie and Ike Howard go for this upcoming season? Now, I am extremely bullish on both of these players. I am very optimistic that at least one of these guys is going to stick and make a meaningful impact. At least one of them is going to be a top 6 forward on this team next year. And a lot of that is hope. A lot of that is me expecting based on their amateur records, and Savoie AHL. AHL is not an amateur league, but developmental league, I'll say, for the purposes of specificity. When we're talking about it in that context, there is the capacity to play at a higher level and really do develop, because I am at a point where I want to see guys play. I want to see young players get a shot and one of the things that's working in Howard and Savoie's favor is the simple fact the Oilers don't really have a choice. They are going to need one of those guys, or David Tomasek, or someone we're not talking about right now, to come in and play at a reasonably impactful level. Because as much as I like Vasily Podkolzin and Andrew Mangiapane, I don't think those are top 6 forwards on a team capable of winning a Stanley Cup. I think the ceiling isn't high enough. Yes, they have high floors. They are dependable veteran hockey players, but I also just don't think those skill sets are going to be commiserate with winning. That's the key here. And look, if you start somewhere in the regular season, doesn't mean you're going to end up there. There's a world where they start in the top 6, and by the end of the year, the Oilers have a deadline trade. Howard or Savoie plays their way into the top 6, and it's an entirely different conversation. But the Oilers are going to need at least one of those two young guys to make an impact and to be a net positive, which is a tall ask for a team that doesn't seem to be particularly patient with guys trying to figure things out. And generally, we don't really see young guys play prominent roles on Stanley Cup caliber teams. It's just not something we see in today's NHL. Now, there are exceptions. You know, Cale Makar was in his second year in the NHL when the Avs won the Cup. Bowen Byram was very early on in his development cycle. Mackie Samsovic was on the Panthers this past year, but that's one guy and playing a very small role. So I'll be very curious to see how the Oilers decide to try and ramp those guys up to put them in a position to succeed. Do they start right away with McDavid and Draisaitl? Do they start in the bottom 6 and the Oilers kind of do it in a training wheels type of way where they let them play in a sheltered environment, lower stakes, and as they establish competency and prove worth, then you give them a bigger role. I'll be very curious to see how Chris Knoblauch handles that. We know how Chris Knoblauch feels about defensive effort and two-way play, so it's going to be incumbent upon those guys to hit the ground running defensively and playing with a meaningful intent, especially for the full length of the ice, because we saw that work against Jeff Skinner, who has multiple 30-goal seasons to his name. Savoie does not have multiple 30-goal seasons. Ike Howard has yet to play an NHL game. So there's a lot to unpack here, but we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about these big picture questions. We'll hit on Evan Bouchard's extension. We'll talk about the arguments of maybe upgrading in net as opposed to somewhere in the forward group, and a whole lot more on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a game with your friends or family? Maybe it's game day and suddenly you just have that itch to get in the action. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite more people to go to the game with you. Game Time makes it happen. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app drop closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for upcoming games. I'm going to Mets Reds next weekend when they retire David's rights number. Cannot wait for that. Game Time has last-minute deals and zone deals for big savings like 10% off for FIFA World Cup matchups. And my personal favorite part of the Game Time ticketing buying experience, seat views in the app before you buy, so you know exactly where you're sitting before you get in the building. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. So one of the interesting tidbits that's out there that was reported over the last week or so is the Oilers were, I won't say pressured or coaxed, but the Oilers had their hand forced by the simple matter of the fact the Carolina Hurricanes were purportedly prepared to offer Evan Bouchard an offer sheet. And after last year's experiences, losing Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway, and the fact that Evan Bouchard is one of the 10 best defensemen in the NHL, the Oilers didn't really have a choice here. And I've said that over the course of the last month or so leading up to that extension, just because, simple matter of the fact, you lose a top 10 defenseman in the NHL, you are not going to be the same caliber of team. We all understand what an important and what an integral role Evan Bouchard plays in the success of the Edmonton Oilers. You look at his splits with and without McDavid, he is more than capable of driving play away from the Oilers' best player. You put him in positions where he is going to thrive. You run a power play, you hope that you're going to be able to get better power play performance out of your unit as a whole. You went from 5th to 11th year over year. Not the end of the world, but definitely a drop-off in efficiency. I've cited the Oilers' power play as one of the reasons they ultimately came up short in the Stanley Cup final this past season. And the big question as far as Evan Bouchard goes, I have no reservations about this contract. For the next 4 years, $10.5 million is going to seem really cheap. And you're getting his prime years. He is in his mid-20s. You are getting him through his UFA years, and that will put him in a position 4 years from now to look at a $15 to $20 million per year contract. And again, real quick, I know a lot of people hear those numbers and their eyes start to pop out of their heads like it's a Looney Tunes cartoon, but you got to remember, the salary cap is going to explode. There's a new TV deal coming down the coffer. You have revenues from gates continuing to go up. You have the looming proposition of expansion franchises coming into the mix and increasing hockey-related revenue through new ticket holders. So there are so many avenues to growing the pot of overall revenue for both the players and ownership alike that these salaries are going to go up. And we know, based on the way professional sports work, even if teams aren't particularly close or even if they're middle of the pack, they don't want to lose talent and they're going to spend money. And I do think, and a lot of insiders have speculated, it's one of the reasons we haven't seen as much trade activity as we had thought we would over the last 2-3 weeks or so, is that teams are just a little more liquid. They have a little more flexibility and they're not going to just cut bait with a player because they feel the financial squeeze if they can help it. You know, if you're a middle of the road team, you don't want to lose any talent. And sure, maybe you want to try and get a little bit younger, a little bit cheaper. But at the same time, you know, youth does not score goals. Talent scores goals. And if you have a proven player, even if they're a little more on the expensive side, I think you're a bit more inclined to try and hold on and figure it out with so much more flexibility in terms of what you're going to operate money-wise. So we've discussed the Matthew Savoie, Ike Howard. We've discussed the Evan Bouchard extension. We've discussed the hypothetical Connor McDavid extension. The next question, money-wise, for the Oilers, and I do think it's a reasonable question even now, the Oilers made a conscious decision. They, more likely than not, are going to stick with this goalie tandem of Calvin Pickard and Stuart Skinner. I am very opposed to this. I think most Oilers fans would like an upgrade, even if it's just on the backup. Even if you're just upgrading on Pickard and you're going from an 890 goalie to a 900 goalie, that's not a huge difference, but it's something. It's a gesture. It gives you a little bit of confidence. So I, for one, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, based on where they've spent money on Howard, on Tomasek, on Mangiapane, I can understand why they didn't go get John Gibson. And because they didn't go and get John Gibson, I understand why they didn't go after Alex Lyon. So if they didn't go after Alex Lyon, that tells you they think these two guys are better than him. It tells you that they think these two guys are better than Kaapo Kähkönen, not interested in a Vitek Vanacek situation. So with all of that said, the Oilers have made the conscious decision. The money difference between Calvin Pickard and Stuart Skinner combined, which is $3.6 million, and say John Gibson, who was checking in at $6.5 million, the difference was more worth it to them to spend that $3 million on another roster player. And look, if you want to say they should have tried to find a way to trade Adam Henrique to create that cap difference, okay, that's a different conversation. But I think there is, and I can't believe I'm saying this. I do think there is some merit to the idea that the difference between a $3.5 million goalie and a $6 million goalie is not going to be worth the salary cap difference. That middle tier of goalie, we have consistently seen the goalie that gets paid between $5 and $7 million in this era. Once they prove themselves a little bit, it doesn't really go that well. You think about like the Philip Grubauers of the world, the Darcy Kempers of the world, guys who signed reasonable contracts money-wise, but ultimately just didn't work out for them in that new landing spot. So I don't like the fact the Oilers haven't upgraded the position, but I can at least understand the logic. And that's what I got. That's what I was trying to explain at the top of the show, why I like these open-ended questions where I can present both sides of the argument. I understand the argument. Doesn't mean I need to agree with it, but as long as I can understand it, I know it's rational. I can work with that. That's my goal when it comes to understanding decision makers, whether it's a GM, a coach, a president of hockey operations, whatever. I don't need to agree, but I do need to understand, because if it's irrational, if it's illogical, that's where we start getting into votes of no confidence. But the last question in this second segment, what do I expect from Andrew Mangiapane? I'm so glad I asked. He's one of my favorite players in the NHL. The work he put in 3 years ago now, on that Flames team that went to the second round, lost to the Oilers in the Battle of Alberta. After that great first round series with Dallas, he put up 30 goals. He was playing on a line with Michael Backlund and Blake Coleman. They were playing out of their minds. Some of the best hockey we have seen from a depth line. You saw the Flames take a real leap that one season. Ultimately, it didn't come to fruition. You trade Matthew Tkachuk. You lose Johnny Gaudreau to free agency. You try and replace that production with Nazem Kadri, Jonathan Huberdeau, Mackenzie Weegar, who are all good hockey players. And look, I know Huberdeau has gotten a lot of flack for his performance since leaving Florida, but Huberdeau is undoubtedly a functionally good hockey player. It's just really an environmental thing. He's a conduit type player. He's not a conductor. He doesn't make things happen himself. He's someone that you channel your energy through. But for Mangiapane on this Oilers team, I think he can be better than what they got from Vasily Podkolzin on Draisaitl's left. I think there's a world where he could be effectively your Evander Kane replacement. I think if Mangiapane plays in the top six, maybe sneaks onto that second power play, maybe he chips in 1 or 2 shorthanded goals for the season as well, I could see a world where he's between 15 and 20 goals next year. I could see a world where with some more ice time, he's able to put up counting stats that look a little bit better than maybe he is. And we talk about that all the time here on Locked On Oilers. The everydayers hear me talk about this all the time. The most important contributor to a player's counting stat production is ice time. You need to play to put up stats. The more minutes you play, the better the chance you have of putting up stats. And I think a player like Mangiapane, who's going to get shoehorned into a bigger role than he's played the last 2 years, especially last year in Washington, there's a real chance here for him to pop off and maybe play his way into a big role for this Oilers team and Oilers team going forward. We are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, the questions are going to keep coming, so be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. The next question I have, and I think this is always a fair question, I guess unless you're the Florida Panthers, do you have enough depth? And right now on paper, I feel like the Oilers are very light on the wings. And look, a lot of it is projection. A lot of this is the Oilers are expecting guys to either develop or to produce more in larger roles. So whether that's David Tomasek, who had 20-something goals in the Swedish League last year, whether that's Ike Howard, whether that's Matthew Savoie, whomsoever you're thinking of in that category, if it's Kasperi Kapanen, if it's Vasily Podkolzin, there's a world where I think the Oilers could get something out of one of them. And look, the idea here, and I don't like making this comparison because statistically you're more likely to be struck by lightning than win the lottery, but you got to have enough lottery tickets to have a chance. And when you're shopping in this part of the market, in the European free agents, the college free agent rights, the draft, the restricted free agent rights, the player coming off a down year, the player coming off a buyout player, when you're shopping in that aisle of the store, you know there's a reasonable chance it doesn't work out. That is just the nature of buying players or signing players who have stigmas or deficiencies attached to their games. So the more of those guys you have, yes, a lot more volatility. Just because you buy more lotto tickets doesn't mean you're going to win the lottery. We see teams that draft over and over again in the top 10 not materialize anything in terms of meaningful results, even if they draft pretty good hockey players. So this part of the conversation is really straightforward. I don't think all of those guys are going to have good years. I think at least one or two of them will. I think if I had to pick, I would assume Mangiapane and I would assume Ike Howard. Look, I love Podkolzin. He's not scoring 20 goals. I would be astounded if Vasily Podkolzin scored 20 goals in an NHL season, basically at any point in his career. He's just not that type of player. And look, there are plenty of useful and functional players that are going to score between 10 and 15 goals over the course of a calendar year and play a really useful role on a good team. I think Podkolzin can score 10 to 15 goals. I think if you get 20 to 25 goals out of Vasily Podkolzin, I think that's undoubtedly the highest possible end range of outcomes. And I feel like that's pretty statistically unlikely. It's not impossible, but it is unlikely. When it comes to Savoie, when it comes to Ike Howard, I don't know what to expect. I think so much of it is going to depend on their utility. Where do they play in the lineup? Who are their most common line mates? How much trust does Chris Knoblauch have in them? How much trust does he need to have in them? How much is he going to depend on them to play important roles on this team? So I think the Oilers' depth, particularly on the wings, is a question mark. I guess we can put Trent Frederic in that conversation as well. I just don't expect a whole lot from him. Trent Frederic's a useful hockey player for sure. I just don't expect anything of note. 10 to 15 goals. He'll hit a lot. He'll forecheck. He'll kill penalties if Chris Knoblauch trusts him enough. But I don't expect anything miraculous. I know he's a former first-round pick. I know that carries some gravitas in NHL circles, but nothing you've seen from him at the NHL level, whether it was in Boston, the playoffs this year for the Oilers, nothing jumped off the screen as like, oh my God, this guy, he just needs a chance to break through. I think he's an okay skater when he's healthy. He definitely wasn't in the playoffs for the Oilers. I think he's a guy who felt he needed to play his way into the lineup any way he could. I think that's why he took all those fights when he was a Bruin. I think he really, are very, very reminiscent of early career Tom Wilson in that respect. The idea that I got to do whatever I can to play in this lineup because it's such a stacked team. And Tom Wilson, if you'll recall, early in his NHL career was effectively just a goon. I know he's still, a guy who goes over the line with real consistency. But when Tom Wilson first came into the league, he was a joke. He couldn't really do anything other than instigate, throw questionable hits, and try and start fights. But now he's a useful, functional hockey player on top of the moral gray area. So I think Trent Frederic could certainly maybe, definitely maybe be a 15-goal guy. But again, that's not dynamic. That's not explosive. And look, I know there's only so many of those types of guys going around the entire NHL, let alone on one team. But it does feel like they're a little bit light on the wings. Now, one more question I do have. Is the Oilers' lack of long-term development going to be a problem. And this is where losing Broberg and Holloway in the same offseason really stings. Yes, you turned Ryan McLeod into Matthew Savoie, who had a nice season in the AHL last year, who looks poised to play at the NHL level for a full season this year. You turned Logan O'Reilly, who was probably a year or two away from the NHL, into Ike Howard, who was so demanding to play in the NHL right away that Tampa Bay traded him. And look, Howard's played 3 years of college hockey. He's 21, turning 22. He's on the older side of things as far as prospects go. He played at a pretty high level in college, but you also have to have the caveat that he was 21 playing against 20 and 19 and 18-year-olds. So that is something to consider as well. How much do you want to put credence in winning a Hobie Baker as not an overager, but as someone 3 years into their college career versus, Celebrini, who won it as a freshman, Fantilli, who was the runner-up as a freshman. So that's something to consider as well. The next question I have on my list of questions here, how many moves away are the Oilers from winning a Stanley Cup? And I think in my head, goalie, top 4 defenseman, scoring winger. I think those are the last 3 parts of the checklist for the Oilers here. I think they need one more 20 to 30 goal guy in their top 6. Which very well, it could be Howard, it could be Savoie. I'm not saying this year, but in a year or two, it's not impossible. I think it's not out of the question one of those guys becomes a 20, 25 goal winger, and that changes the tenor there. I think you need to upgrade on Darnell Nurse in the top 4 if you're going to win the Stanley Cup. As much as I like Darnell Nurse, the guy, as an important role he plays culturally within the room amongst the dynamics of the team, I don't see him being good enough to win a Stanley Cup playing a top 4 role. I think at the money he's at, you can't really afford to play him on your third pair. So I think that's that. And then you need a better goalie. I'm not saying you need a Shesterkin, a Sorokin, a Saros, whomsoever. You need a league average goalie. You need a 905, 910 guy who can occasionally, Aiden Hillia, who can occasionally make something happen. And then the last question I have on my list, how much longer can the Oilers be Stanley Cup contenders with this core? I am defining the core as McDavid, Draisaitl, Evan Bouchard, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Zach Hyman, and Darnell Nurse. There are other guys, Trent Frederick's got a long-term contract as well, but we talked pretty in-depth about Ryan Nugent-Hopkins the other day. I think he is fully in the supporting role of his career at this point. I am not convinced him or Hyman are long-term building blocks. They can be functional and useful players in sheltered roles, but I think the Oilers are probably a year or two away from needing major upgrades to their forward group in support of McDavid and Draisaitl. They're going to need to find their next winger, whoever they want, whoever that is in their minds to be the Hyman/Nugent-Hopkins production replacement. I'm not saying you need to get rid of those guys, but as they get older, they are going to need to put up more. They are going to need more numbers from the spots those guys represent in the lineup. That will do it for today's question-laden edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit that alarm bell, get notifications whenever new episodes go live. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Till then, let's go Oilers.